Hey there, Magic Gang. Welcome to Glenn Bishop's Magic, Mysteries, and much more. We're going to talk today a little bit about a person I really respect is Dai Vernon. We talked last week about the Revelations and Expert at the Card Table, and this, of course, is Dai Vernon's book that he wrote that has Expert at the Card Table in it, and his observations about Erdnase and other things. Anyway, today we're going to move on to another book. This book is called The Stars of Magic. This was published by a magic dealer in New York called Louis Tannen, and the shop was called Tannen's. Anyway, Tannen's published The Stars of Magic, and I consider this particular book, again, one of the 10 best books ever written on magic. The reason is it's written and it has routines, and these are solid entertainment routines by some of the best magicians in magic. This is Tony Slidini. This is Dr. Jacob Daly. This is a routine by Dai Vernon, another routine by Dai Vernon, another routine by Dai Vernon. There's a routine by Francis Carlisle. These are all top pros, and basically, I remember talking about this book in place called Houdini's Pub. And if you can come in and get a close-up here, that's Dai Vernon when he was much younger, when he was living in New York City. And this was right at the time where he was getting the reputation as one of the top sleight-of-hand close-up magicians, close-up artists of that time. And you have to understand this time was different than later on with what, later on. Close-up magic technically was not a way magicians earned a living in these days. If you earned a living as a magician in these days, basically you were a stage magician or a stand-up magician. If you did close-up, you were a private party entertainer at best. In other words, you went out and you had an agent and you did private parties. The interesting thing about this particular book is that it has triumph in it, and it's Dai Vernon's, what magicians would say, Dai Vernon's original routine. Well, technically it's not his original routine. It's his original shuffle, okay? Because if you read the starting here, if we can have a close-up of this text area right here, it says Dai Vernon's Triumph, okay? Basically, if you come in really close on this text, you'll see that Dr. Jacob Daly talks about triumph as a false shuffle, not a magic trick. Basically, what Dr. Jacob Daly says in this particular little area of text is that this shuffle is an easier shuffle to do than the push-through shuffle. And that's a false shuffle. And then basically it goes on to describe almost the entire routine of how to do it as a false shuffle, not as a trick. So technically, triumph means an easier version of the false shuffle, like the Zorro shuffle is a version of a false shuffle. As a matter of fact, I believe that Herb Zorro invented the Zorro shuffle, and that's a variation of Dai Vernon's triumph shuffle. Well, basically what it is, it's a false shuffle to replace the push-through shuffle. Well, the push-through shuffle was a gambling move to basically keep the deck, the entire deck, in order. Okay? This deck is not in order. I should have separated it between reds and blacks. I guess I'll do that right now. We'll take the reds and the blacks and we'll just slowly separate the two. And I will talk about what the false shuffle was for. Basically, if you had a stacked deck and the deck was set up so that you could deal it out and have your partner end up with the highest hand and all the other players' good hands, or if you had the deck, stack deck set up so that all the players would get good hands and you would get the best hand, after the deck would be brought into the game, which would be probably a deck switch, which is called a cold deck. And I talked about a cold deck in the Erdenay's talk that I did last week. So basically, you would need a false shuffle. I'm going to show you that this half is blacks and this half is red. Now supposedly if it's set up, okay, if you shuffled these two halves together, okay, now the deck is brought in, it's a set up deck, and you're going to shuffle the deck, okay. The best way to do it, this is what would be called a push-through shuffle. This is a gambler's move that is considered to be a very difficult move. Okay, and as you'll notice, as we span the cards down, I shuffled the deck, but the deck is still separated reds and blacks. It's actually in the exact order it was before I shuffled the deck. Well, the Triumph Shuffle was basically a shuffle that was designed to do the basic thing. Okay, it was a false shuffle that is a lot easier than the push-through shuffle. Then later on in the book, okay, in the explanation of the Triumph Shuffle, this card effect takes place, okay? And I'm just going to run down through the deck of cards like this, okay? And I would have a spectator say stop, and then of course they would stop at a card, and it doesn't matter what the card is because I'm talking about the shuffle. I'm not trying to do a trick here. Well, let's say the card that they selected was the 8 of clubs. Now, I wouldn't know what that selected card was, but the 8 of clubs would be returned to the deck. The deck would be mixed up, of course, and the deck would be shuffled. Okay. Then comes many different stories of how different magicians have used this, and then we talk about giving the deck out to be handled by the spectator and says, here, you shuffle the deck. And then the spectator took the deck like this, turned one half face up and the other half face down, and then he took the deck of cards like this, and he shuffled the two halves together. Now you'll notice when I'm shuffling the deck together, I'm doing what gamblers would call an open shuffle. It's basically, it's open, so you can basically see what's going on. The two cards are, you know, the two halves are mixed. There is one half face up and the other face down. And then the audience is on this side, so you'd spring the deck here and show them face up and face down cards, and then you push the halves together, and then you wind up with a deck of cards with some cards that are face down, and of course some cards that are face up, and some cards back to back, and of course some cards are face to face. Okay, it really doesn't matter. Okay, and then you as the magician, I used to say in my pattern, I'd say, how long do you think it would take me to straighten out that deck if I did straighten them all out? And then they'd say a number, like maybe 10 seconds, and I'd say, okay, do you have a watch? And I'd say, you time me, and you say go when you're ready for me to start, and I'll say stop and I'm done. And then they say go, and I say stop right away. And then of course I spread the deck and I say, look, they're all facing the same direction, except for one selected card. And that's their selection. Now the fun thing about this trick is you could do it with 1 card, 2 cards, 3 cards, or even 4 cards. It doesn't really matter. Okay, the Triumph Shuffle works with using several cards. Okay, but the mistake magicians make is they call the trick Triumph. Actually, that trick was invented a long time ago, and I don't remember the exact instances of that particular trick, but it used to be called the face up and face down, the effect of face up and face down, things like that. And then it came out as the drunken shuffle, which is basically a thing which they do, the flip-flop shuffle, which is this thing, where they go and mix them up face and face down, and that's more or less done in the hands. And then you wind up with the pattern that some drunk took the deck of cards and did this to me, so to speak, you know, that type of thing, you know. And then basically, the face-up, face-down shuffle, it works almost the same way, except the Triumph Shuffle streamlines it so that you can do it on the table. Okay? So that basically was out long before the actual Vernon version, which people now call Triumph. But let me tell you, Triumph is basically a false shuffle, like Dr. Jacob Daly said. Then you could also use it to streamline the effect of the face-up and face-down shuffle, which is actually a different trick. And I do believe Hugard talked about this in one of his volumes. Hugard wrote several books on magic, and it might even go back even before Hilliard's time. But anyway, let me tell you a little bit more about Dai Vernon as we talk about Dai Vernon. Okay? This is Dai Vernon doing Ring on the Stick. Dai Vernon was kind of an interesting person in magic just as general. First I thought he was basically one of the greatest close-up magicians there was. And the reason was that this was one of the first books my dad ever told me to start studying. When I started magic, I was about 8 years old. I was doing birthday party shows, and then my dad handed me Erdnase Expert at the card table and said, see what you can get out of this. Okay? So I started with Erdnase. Then I wanted more stuff to read, and then he gave me Harry Lorraine's Close-Up Card Magic, and also the book The Stars of Magic. Well, Dai Vernon basically stood out as one of the great magicians, and my dad also said, hey, if you really want to learn some good stuff, this is the guy to learn from. And then he pointed to Dai Vernon's section in The Stars of Magic. And he says, you can take any one of these tricks out and do it. And my dad actually did 3 or 4 of them directly out of the Stars of Magic, but they were directly taught to him by Dai Vernon. When my dad was 19 years old, he was president of the Portland Society of American Magicians, and he was in charge of the lecture group, which was in charge of booking magicians to do lectures for the Portland, Oregon Society of American Magicians. Well, one of the magicians that they booked for a lecture was Dai Vernon. And you have to understand, this SAM had people in it like Lee Grable, let's see, Jerry Andrus, which was one of my dad's best friends, and Jimmy Stoppard, and quite a lot of very, very good magicians. If you know Jerry Andrus, he's written several books, done lectures, and he's best known for the linking pins, which are the safety pins links. Well, anyway, Jerry Andrus and my dad spent the day with Dai Vernon, and Dai Vernon taught him how to do Triumph and cutting the aces and several other things. So my dad was a super fan of Dai Vernon, and that's why he pointed him out to me. So I started working on Dai Vernon stuff, and it's quite interesting. The older I got, the more magicians I met, the more people you get opinions about. And I was over at Jack Gwynn's apartment. He had a small apartment above Pat's Hobby Store, and he owned the building. The Gwynn family owned the building that Pat's Hobby Store was in, and Jack Gwynn's, some type of relatives of Jack Gwynn's and Ann Gwynn's relatives, they owned the Pat's Hobby Store, and they were the people that were behind the counters. Well, I'd go over there in the wintertime and shovel their walk. They had this balcony out front, and you'd have to come out of their apartment and go out onto the balcony, and I would shovel their balcony. Okay, so basically, after Jack Gwynn died, I still did that, and I found out that Jack and Ann Gwynn really didn't like Dai Vernon. They thought he was a person that would show up and be in the vaudeville theater. You have to understand, Jack Gwynn was a vaudeville performer. He did big illusions. He did also some little bit of sleight of hand close-up, because everybody did that. And he made a living in vaudeville, and then later on went on to nightclubs, and then later had a full evening show. Well, Jack Gwynn and Ann Gwynn, they didn't really like Dai Vernon. They thought he was annoying, and he was this amateur that would come in, and basically they would he would give their opinions about everybody's acts. And Ann thought it was idiotic because This guy, she did not consider a working professional. She considered him a magician that did private parties once in a while and basically enjoyed hanging out with magicians, which partly that's what he was. So anyway, Anne and Jacqueline didn't really like him very much. There are several other magicians that didn't like him very much too that were also performers. Dai Vernon got this reputation as being this incredibly great reputation, and there was a reputation of being one of the great sleight of hand artists, magicians that there ever was, and people hero worship him quite a lot. I hero worshipped him when I was a lot younger. But right now, I feel that Dai Vernon is the type of guy. He was a really nice man, a real gentleman. He was really nice to me. And I met him in Davenport, Iowa. Bob Brown owned part of a magic shop in Davenport, Iowa. And I knew Bob Brown through the Marshall Burdine Magic Shop. He stopped in one day. And anyway, Bob Brown had Dai Vernon at his, and it ended up to be the last lecture he did away from the Magic Castle, which is quite interesting. So Dai Vernon left the castle to go to Davenport, Iowa to do this lecture. I went to see the lecture along with one of my best magician friends, Jim Gleason. Jim and I got into his Camaro, and we drove across state to Davenport, Iowa, and we saw Dai Vernon lecture. And he was one of the few magicians, in my opinion, that actually lived up to his reputation. He had a big reputation, and he was in his mid-80s at the time, and he could still do it. He still could do the sleight of hand, and he was great. His second deal was flawless. He basically did a lot of the stuff that was in the Stars of Magic, which is right here. Okay, and I'll tell you a real quick interesting story before I wrap this up. Dai Vernon, okay, did a lecture, and he did a 3-hour lecture for magicians, okay? Joe Casari was there, who's the card manipulator. He kept yelling from the offside, "Hey, Dai, when you going to take a break?" And then Dai would say, "What, you tired?" And he just kept going on and on and on and on. So finally, they stepped in, the group of people that put the lecture together, they stepped in and said, "Dai, you have to take a break because, you know, this is going really long." So he says, "Okay, we'll start up in a few minutes." Now the interesting thing is, he closed performing 3-card Monte. That was the last thing he did in the first half lecture. And the first half lecture was probably at least an hour and a half. Okay, so he closed. So I was working on 3-card Monte at the time. I could do it because Buddy Farman showed me a whole bunch of moves, and I was doing 3-card Monte. But there was one move I didn't get that Dai Vernon did that I wanted to learn. So I thought that during the lecture, I'll talk to him about it. So halftime, everybody goes out to go to the washroom and get something to eat or something like that real quick. And Dai Vernon's packing up his stuff, okay? And I walk up to him and I say, "Mr. Vernon, 3-card Monte, there was a move in there that I didn't quite understand. I was hoping that you could start the second half with 3-card Monte and explain that move slower." And then he looked at me and he said, "3-card Monte, son? Sure." And he sat down and he opened up a deck of cards, got 3 cards out for him, 3 cards out for me, and he went through the entire routine 3 times. Okay? Went through the entire routine step by step 3 times, teaching me step by step exactly how he did it. Okay? Now I'm really concentrating on this, so I'm just sitting there looking at him, and he's across the table from me. It's like a card table. And he's going through it step by step, each little move, each little thing, and explaining each little detail of how he does it. Okay? Okay? While this is happening, the room is now filling up with magicians. Okay? And it's, you know, they're all standing around the table watching Dai Vernon show me how to do 3-card Monte. Okay? So now, Suddenly, Dai Vernon, after the third time, he says, "Young man, you really do have the idea of this entire routine. So I suggest you take it home with you and practice it, and you pretty much closely almost have it mastered now." And he looked up, and then Dai Vernon saw all the people surrounding him around the table, and he says, "Well, I think we have to stop right now," Dai Vernon says, "and I think we should start the second half." And he gets up, and he starts the second half of the lecture. He didn't take a break at all. And then he did another hour and a half. This man is incredible, and he incredibly likes magic. And he enjoys being with magicians that enjoy magic as much as him. So that's basically my personal memory of Dai Vernon. And I did meet him once or twice before he passed on again. But he definitely was a gentleman, and he certainly gave magic a lot of practical and useful stuff that magicians should study and they should use if they're doing magic professionally. Anyway, that's my opinion of Dai Vernon, and that's my story about Dai Vernon. And I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for listening.